try to improve performance that end users are going to be experiencing just by taking advantage of the fact that they have more than one option to choose from. And before I jump that, let me just acknowledge that the people I've been doing the work with. Professor Sarkar is actually a graduate of this very same, and Evangelist Virgidis is the student that sexuality Professor Sarkar and I are co-advising. All right, so very broadly speaking, and so here the problem is stated in a quote-unquote setting, which is sort of a wireless setting, but it actually applies equally well to a wired environment. So what is that? The situation, you have multiple network options, multiple channels, multiple paths. It could be different frequencies, different time slots, could be different overlay paths, could be multi-home to two different providers. I mean, which way it's going to be offered to doesn't really matter, right? But you have those multiple channels, and now the question is, can I take advantage of that particular fact to improve performance? And in particular, when you have sort of multiple users, you could be saying, well, each user gets one channel, or you could be saying, well, I'm going to be mixing and matching who is using what channel where, right? So that means then, how do I do that sharing? And that's pretty much what I'm going to be looking at. Right? So the one user many channel is really trying to, it adds a little bit of complexity, not in the sense that it means that you have to distribute your packet transmission possibly over different types of interfaces or frequencies and so on. And there are actually lots, it's not a new thought, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, this is not really a brand new idea. And there, if you look at the physical layer, right, I mean, MIMOs, right, or things such as OFDM, are exploiting some form of diversity. I mean, there's always a lot of things that can be gained when you're playing with multiple choices and you're trying to be intelligent on how to use them, right? Routing tries also to take advantage of diversity, and you've had diversity routing proposals that have been floating in the literature and in some cases being used for quite some time. So let me sort of now, that's sort of the 20 or 30 or whatever is your favorite number, 1,000 feet view, right? So let me try to focus a little bit on what is it that I'm going to be looking at specifically in the context of this talk, right? So the first assumption that I'm going to be making is that the way users are going to be assigned and using channel is not going to be affecting the channel quality, right? And that's an okay assumption when, for example, the characteristics of the channel are external. Fading doesn't depend on whether a user is using that channel or not. And it's also okay if the user is really not a dominant contributor to whatever the channel is carrying. Like, if you have an LC192 pipe, typically, which is shared by a gazillion of different users, every single user is not changing the characteristics, the load on that channel in a meaningful manner. The second important thing is I'm going to be looking at an open loop system, no feedback. I don't want to have to worry about monitoring all those channels when I have more than one, trying to understand what they're doing, and then adjust my decision as a result of that information. So I'm going to assume that I have some knowledge of what the channel looks like, the long-term statistics of the channel, but I'm not going to be monitoring or getting any channel state information. Right? And I'm not therefore going to be basing any decision in terms of where and how to transmit packet on real-time channel state information. And sort of my basic approach is going to be figuring out ahead of time a transmission schedule that is going to tell my user when and where to transmit its packets. So one packet channel 1, two packets channel 2, one packet channel 3, and then coming back. It could be a deterministic, as we'll see, policy or a probabilistic one. Right? The other thing is that, which is sort of consistent with the first one, is that I'm assuming that there are no interactions between users that are accessing the channel. So if I go back to the previous setup, that would mean that this is in this setting, this is some form of access point that's going to be telling the user, you transmit on that channel, and then you transmit on another one, and so on, so that they're not colliding, or at least in the current setting, I'm not assuming any collision. In the case of overlay network, it basically, again, simply means that the fact that a particular user is translating on one overlay path as opposed to another one is not affecting what the other guys might be seeing. So the basic thing that I want to try to understand in that sort of particular setting is, does it pay to have multiple choices? And in particular, if I'm being given 5 channels, 5 paths, with some knowledge of their characteristics, 1% loss rate, burst losses of 2.5, another one has 0.3 loss rate, that burstiness of 5.6, and so on. When does it pay to have those multiple options and sort of in order to improve my performance? and more interestingly, right, how big is the improvement, right? I mean, if we're talking 2%, sure, it's interesting, right, and it's potentially useful, but probably not. Right? The cost, because there's, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a cost associated with just not sending all your packets the same way, right? You need some level of agility or intelligence, right? The cost might not be worth the improvement. And the other important question is that performance improvement, stable, right? Namely, if I deviate by some slight, minute, delta from, the optimal, does my performance suddenly collapse, even maybe below to a level that I would have if I was not even thinking diversity? And the last aspect is, assuming that the answers to the first two are, yeah, it makes sense, and if you do it well, you can actually reap reasonable benefits. Well, how do I do it well? Right? I mean, is it 1 packet here, 2 packets here? And more importantly, does it vary a lot? If I go from 1 network, 2 networks, 3 networks, 4 networks, 5 networks, how does that behave in general? Right? And the last is sort of, again, sensitivity analysis, which is sort of related to that other point. So these are the general questions I answer during the talk. So I'm going to assume bursty channels. A, Bernoulli channels are not very interesting, and B, most of the channels that you run into in practice exhibit some form of burstiness. And really, when diversity helps is, what you don't want is, you don't want to be stuck with a channel that suddenly went bad for an extended period of time. I mean, if the channels never went bad for an extended period of time, I can handle that ahead of time by putting in coding and so on. And so really what we're going to be looking at are reasonably bursty channel. And then diversity can be upheld because it essentially avoids you being stuck with that bad channel that's staying bad for a long time. We're going to pick one type of code, and we're not married to those codes. You could use any kind of erasure codes. But essentially, those make sort of the description and the analysis a little bit easier. We're using so-called MK diversity codes. So you have a message which consists of K packet, and your goal is to successfully transmit messages, right? Because the channel is not error, you're adding some redundancy in your transmission, and that redundancy essentially means that you're increasing from K to N packets, and the code is designed in such a way that in order for you to be able to successfully recover or reconstruct your initial message, you only need to get any K out of those N packets. The other thing that we're looking at is the position policies, and the one that we're going to be narrowing our focus on are very simple probabilistic or deterministic scheduling policies. So we're not going to try to have very, very fancy policies with memory and things of that type. It's basically you flip a coin or you have a predetermined schedule and you cycle through that particular schedule. And by the way, it makes the analysis a little bit simpler. So as I mentioned earlier, there's been quite a bit of work. The two most, the relevance are Golubchik and Abduni, which is about, they share a set of authors that looked at similar problem. They were more interested in saying, okay, we have that particular channel, what performance benefit do I get? So they didn't really look at the when, what, and how type of thing. Sirius and Haas did look at the how. They were looking at trying to understand what is the, how can I compute the optimal policy, but they looked at them in a case that was sort of much simpler, which means that whenever I start my transmission and I have multiple channel, if a channel goes bad, it goes bad forever. Right? And so that essentially drastically reduced the state space that you need to consider when trying to have the optimal policy. There's been a whole bunch of work also with a more theoretical bend on diverse area has been sort of video transmission over a wireless channel. Because again, wireless channels are such that you very often have multiple choices, and video is essentially of a bit rate that is typically higher than what most wireless channels give you and not so tolerant to losses, and therefore understanding the channel give rise to the need to use every single bits and piece of transmission capability that you have. But those works are much more targeted at what is the right code for a diversity setting. Now, a couple of very quick definitions: long-term error rate, expected burst lengths are the sort of the two main characteristics that we're going to be looking at as far as the characteristics are concerned. I've just talked about the message size, the code size, right? And we're also going to be asking, in order to measure performance, what is it that you're expecting? And we're going to be measuring that performance expectation through P-min, which is essentially the minimum successful message transmission probability. And policies are going to be characterized by schedule. These could be probabilities or identifying how many transmissions you have on a particular channel. So you can use all kinds of channel models. The one that I'm going to be relying on here is the simplest of all, right? Because it does capture some very basic property, and it helps essentially sort of clarify and helps understand what is going on. So it's a two-state channel. It will allow me to have some bursty loss patterns, right? And basically, the channel altitude, the good and the bad states. When you're in the bad state, you're losing packets. When you're in the good state, you're not losing packets. You can tweak that and say, in the good state, I'm losing packet with a certain probability. In the bad state, I'm losing packet with a higher probability. Doesn't make much of a difference, right? So obviously, there's limitation. We'll be getting over some of those when we investigate the sensitivity to the model, in the sense that we'll be looking at channels that might exhibit, statistics that are different. The on and off period might actually have a completely different distribution, and we'll be looking at our results sensitive to that. But that is essentially the basic model. Right. And our performance metric is what we call the effective rate. I mean, bottom line, it's trying to figure out how many messages do I get through correctly. Right? And so you get k packets per message. It takes n packets to send them, and for every block of k messages, the probability that you receive it, if you're using an NK code and a policy, a scheduling policy A, is this particular probability, and the product of the two is essentially how many messages are you getting per unit of time. And comparing policies is going to be done through a relative comparison, which is saying how much more do you get in terms of this effective rate if you're using policy B instead of policy A. And in most of our comparison, policy A is going to say, well, you have many channels, pick the best one with the best possible code. That's going to be our reference. Right? So if I had many choices and I didn't want to use diversity, the obvious thing to do is to pick the best one of all the possible choices. And then policy B is whatever we're currently looking at, and this particular ratio then gives you the relative gain that this gives you. I'll go quickly through that. It's standard stuff, nothing very sophisticated. When you have this Gilbert-Taylor channel and you start adding them, basically you can build in aggregate Markov chain and even bigger Markov chains with all the possible transitions, and you can define recursive solution to these things. And once you have the recursive solution, it grows, obviously. It can grow exponentially with the number of channels that you're considering, but it's computable. And so you can then compute for any particular policy the performance that you're getting, and if you can compute the performance, you can then search for the different policies and identify what an optimal policy is. Yes?
So you're assuming that you just have one user and you want to optimize its performance.
Right, so I'll come back to that. There are a whole bunch of ways of looking at it. Right? When you have multiple users, right, then the metric that you want to measure, optimize, is the sum of all their effective rate, right? And under the constraint that they have to use consistent policies, right? I mean, they cannot all be using the same channel at the same time, right? So this is assuming a single user, right? Now, if you have multiple users, you can then derive what are the policies that the others are going to be using, and you can even search that even bigger space to find, the maximum out of all of that, right? It will turn out, and that's sort of a reason for why I'm focusing on that, that most of the interesting cases, and by interesting I mean cases where the benefits are substantial, end up being cases where you're distributing your transmission more or less equally across all channels. And if you're transmitting equally across all channels, the one user versus the many user case pretty much boil down to the same thing. All right, so the first thing that we want to try to understand, and when can we increase this effective rate, maybe what combination, right? And as I said, we'll use the single channel as a reference, and then we'll compare what we can get with the best single channel in the whole choice that we've been given to different policies that we can come up with. So very quickly before jumping into some of the results, what the intuition, as I mentioned earlier, is really what diversity gives you is that it enables you to avoid being stuck with a bad channel for a very long time. Right? And therefore, there will be cases where adding a bad channel to a good channel can really boost up your performance. But and we'll see some of those examples. Right? The two things that to keep in mind is that there are two ways of improving your performance. Right? One is by increasing your probability of successful message transmission. Remember, the effective rate is that K over N times P of success. Right? The other one is by being able to decrease the overhead, the coding overhead that you're incurring in order to achieve that target probability P-mean that we are seeking, right? Remember I said what I want to have is a certain probability of getting my message through that exceeds a threshold value P-min. Yeah. If you didn't have that, actually you don't need coding, right? The best thing to do is use no coding, and it's relatively easy to prove. And so, and of these two, this is the dominant factor. I mean, it's relatively easy to see why, right? I mean, if I have any kind of reasonable success probability as my target, like 99%, well, how much can I gain? I can gain 1%, right? And therefore, this is not a huge range. While if I can use, a 10-15 code instead of a 10-20 code, hey, just going from 20 to 15 is a pretty substantial improvement. So that's the thing that one of the things I was mentioning earlier. This is for the two-channel case. We've done other investigation in more than a two-channel case, and the results are not that drastically different. This is actually looking at a whole bunch of different channel combinations. So every single little dot that you see here was one particular pair of channel where we vary, long-term error rate and burstiness of the channels across a pretty broad range of parameters. And the key things and this is the optimal policy. So basically you search the whole policy space. For each one of those, you can solve the Markov chain using the recursive solution that I alluded to earlier, and you can find what is the increasing rate that buys you. And what you can see is that the places where you get 60, 70, 50, even 40% is not bad, right? Type of improvement, most of those guys happen in this range. Now, it doesn't mean that using channels equally always give you 40 or 50%, but at least you know that this is sort of the range in which you're going to potentially see a significant benefit. If you have a policy that's using one channel only 10% or 15% of the time, typically the benefits improvement are going to be very limited. So we're going to be focusing on those cases and try to understand when and where do I find myself in a situation where I'm going to be using all the different channels equally. But before we jump into that, let's spend a little bit more time essentially try to get a better understanding of what are the other cases when I have two very different channels and what happens in those cases. And one of the issues that arise, which I think I was alluding to earlier when I answered your question, is that when you have different users, right, they all have different schedule, they may end up using different codes, right? And if the channels are very different, they're not all going to be seeing the same performance, right? So one of them will see a much better performance than the other, and so if you want to have any kind of fairness in those systems, you've got to rotate identity, you've got to potentially rotate codes, right? And that's pretty expensive, right? I mean, I don't think that I would want to design a system where I have to, flip my transmission schedule every so often, do it in a coordinated way between all the users, and similarly load a new code and let my receiver know that I'm using a different code. I mean, yes, it's doable. I know that it's been done in certain, wireless systems, but it does cost quite a bit more, right? And so, really would like to understand if and when that happens, and does it really help to any significant extent, right? So this is taking, and we've used that channel because it's a popular channel. It's a GSM channel, which has a particular error rate of about 5% and a particular burst of about 5 to 6 packets. I don't remember exactly. So that's my one channel. And now I'm saying, okay, here's my one base channel, and let me look at all the other channels of different error rates and burstiness that when combined optimally with that GSM channel give me 25% performance improvement. Right? Actually, you can get more. If you combine two GSM channels, you get about 47% improvement, which is actually why this line just starts shooting up here, because if you were getting down to the same error rate as the GSM channel, you're not at 25%, you're at 47%. And this curve is saying what is the channel that combined with the GSM channel gives you 25%, exactly 25% improvement. And so what that shows you is that there is a whole range of channels, right, for which, I mean, 25% is an arbitrary number, right? You could have picked 30% and then you would have a slightly shifted curve, and if you had 47%, you would have had a curve that goes through this guy, right? But there are, and the point that the figure wants to make is there are quite a few channels for which a combination with the GSM channel gives rise to actually a significant improvement. Now, the other thing is, well, then how often do I use it? And this is unfortunately actually it's a bad slide. I've meant to update it many, many times, but never mind. I've taken two channels, one of them which is much worse than the other. Right? So if you were looking at the previous slide, right, the previous slide towards the right-hand side, these are pretty bad channels. This is actually the channel with a 25% error rate, which is probably as bad as you probably wouldn't want to use a channel. So we're going to take a channel which is in that range, about 9%, and therefore will be less bursty than the GSM channel, and we're taking actually here a channel with 1%. Right? And the question is, now that you have these two very different channels, how do you use them? And not surprisingly, you basically are going to be using the bad channel. This is plotting the probability of using the good channel. Right? So when you have a small message size, you're actually going to be using it 70%. The second point that this slide makes, and that making 2 points on one side is probably not a good idea. But the second point that this makes is actually, if you increase the message size, the expected things happen, right? And a very large message size essentially ends up making any burst size go away, and every channel is end up looking like a Bernoulli channel. And when you have a Bernoulli channel, the optimal policy is trivially to pick the one with the lowest error rate. So after some point here, right, you end up picking the best channel all the time. Right? So what this shows, though, is that yes, it can help. Right? Namely, using a bad channel in addition to a good channel does help, but it is also a situation where the bad channel is used much less often than the good channel, which is reasonably intuitive. Now, coming back to your question would mean that if I had two users sharing those two channels, and I was using the optimal policy from the point of view of the first user, the other user is then stuck with using the bad channel, 70% of the time, and therefore would be getting a much worse rate. And if you do the joint optimization, you still have a very imbalanced situation. So it's not a question of, if I'm doing the joint optimization, they are both again using the two channels equally, that would not be optimal. You would then have a sum of rates which is much lower than the sum of the rate that it's actually most of the time, or very often, the joint optimization is very close to doing the optimal things for one guy and then picking whatever is left for the other guy. But the point that this sort of highlights is that, you have discrepancies, right? So yes, adding a bad channel will help, but if you're in situations where you need to coordinate between users and rotate, their code assignment and the transmission scheduling policies, that will add complexities, right? If you're now in an environment where you don't care, there are not many users, I have two overlay paths, right, and I'm adding an overlay path, that's okay. Then it's, then it's actually a valid, potentially valid thing to, add a bad, by, a good provider and a bad provider, and by having diversity and saying a few of your packets onto the bad provider channel, you may still be able to improve your performance and not increase your costs.
So what is the intuition of those fluctuations?
The problem, see, this is a discrete problem, right? And I'm changing the message size, right? And I still want to keep a particular probability of success. So my code will also potentially change, right? And when you're dealing with discrete problem, you get transitions up and down. The boundaries are not always at the same place. So the trends are consistent, but when exactly and what is the optimal policy? Because here I may have a 2031 code, and then if I go to 21, it might be a 2131 still, right? Because I had enough margin in the 2031 code to actually still meet my P-min, which is, I think, 0.5% in this case, right? And the optimal policy then gets also affected by that. And so
the optimal policy perhaps is changing, but the performance is not changing that much between these two cases.
That's also, yeah, I don't know actually. I don't have the answer to that particular question. At the very likely, yes.
Are those the simulation results?
No, this is, I mean, solving the, there's no simulation in any of that stuff, except when we get to the end where we're dealing with, arbitrary distributions for the channel characteristics, and there we don't have an analytical model. So the other thing was, do I need different codes, right? Because it's also a question of complexity, right? And what this plots is really three scenarios, no diversity, and this is the relative improvement, right? So S1 is no diversity, S3 is optimal diversity with optimal code selection for each user, and S2 is optimal diversity but not forcing the both users to use the same code, which can be actually pretty penalizing, right? Because you're then going to be dominated by the requirement that even the guy that's using the bad channel most of the time needs to meet the same P-min, right? And so you're not fully allowing the user that's using the good channel most of the time to take full advantage of the benefits that it can get. The bottom line though is that if you compare S2 and S3, there's sort of very little difference, right? And so that is in a certain sense good news, right? In that you don't have to pay the price of that additional complexity of really having to switch codes between the two users. So let me now come back, right? So we have a general understanding, and I think that the net result of it is that although, and the rest of the talk will be spending more time on that, although really where diversity helps is when you're essentially going to be using the channels that are available to you more or less equally, there are still cases where adding that one bad channel might be helpful, right? The disadvantage is that you are not using the two channels equally, so if you have multiple users, you need ways of coordinating their schedule. The good news being that you may not necessarily need to give each one of them different codes if you want to actually take advantage of that. So, the general conclusion would be that, if you don't have to deal with multiple users, then diversity in the sense of adding one or two bad channels, bad paths to a good one is still something worth doing. If you have multi-users, I'm not sure I would sort of recommend it. Now, from that point on, I'm going to be focusing on scenarios and trying to understand when is it that I find myself in those scenarios where I really get significant performance improvement. And as we've seen, they were pretty much located in cases where the significant performance improvement involved using all the different channels more or less at the same time. And so we're going to be using, for that purpose, just limiting ourselves to deterministic policy, simple round-robin policies across all the channels, right? The Markov chain result, for example, are obtained under the assumption of random policies, because you just need to have that randomness so that you can multiply the probabilities and construct the bigger Markov chains, right? You can solve also, actually, in the case of identical use of equal usage of the channels, it's actually much easier to solve the Markov chains because you can decompose everything and then use convolution, and you're home with a much lower cost from a computation standpoint because convolution is pretty easy to compute. So, and there's actually another reason for why we're going to be using deterministic policies is that they actually can, and we don't have a proof for that. So this is not a simulation, but this is not a proof, right? It's just saying that and it's consistent. It's just one example of a gazillion scenarios that we sort of run. Right? The deterministic policy consistently do better. And again, the intuition is, well, if I'm using all the channels the same, right? What you like to do if you hit a bad channel is you want to maximize the amount of time that it takes for you to come back to that bad channel. And even if I take a random policy that uses all the channels equally, maybe probably 1 over n, with that random policy, there's a certain probability that I come back to that one bad channel earlier than if I use a deterministic policy that forces me to scan all the other channels before I come back to that channel. So, intuitively, one should be able to prove that the deterministic policy is, consistently better than a random policy. The problem is that this is dependent on the usage of the optimal code. And the optimal code changes all the time. There are actually simple counterexamples that you can find that show you that if you're not constraining yourself to using the optimal code, that's not necessarily true. And so, as I said, this is a result that is validated by every single experiment that we've run. It's not a result for which we have a proof.
But we assume the channel is independent.
Yes. Oh yeah. So now, in the case of those policies, right? What I want to find out is, when is it the case that I'm finding myself in this good situation of getting significant performance improvement and doing it in a way that's pretty straightforward, namely just simply scanning the channel and transmitting my packet one at a time over those channels, right? And now, obviously, the channels are identical, and again, we don't have a proof for that for exactly the same reasons, right? The intuitive optimal policy is to use those channels equally. But that's a sufficient but not necessary condition. And so we're going to be looking at that problem from 3 different perspectives, right? We're going to be looking at what are channels that could be completely different, maybe different long-term error rate and burstiness, but which when used alone yield the same performance, the same effective rate. So, obviously identical channels belong in that category, but you could have non-identical channels that also satisfy that condition. And then the question is, are those channels also channels for which I get reasonable performance improvement? And more important, are these channels such that I would be using them equally? Right? Now I would be using 2 channels equally, which could have completely different long-term error rate and burstiness. And the other one, which is the one that we're really interested in, what are the channels that are giving me the biggest bang for my buck, right? And what are the channels that, when combined, yield large performance improvements, right? And ideally, right, you like those 3 categories to be more or less the same because, it makes your life easy. It's relatively easy to identify because you're now looking at channels, individually as opposed to in combination. It makes your policy also simple if you're using them equally, and it makes it worth it if they give you big performance improvement. Right? And interestingly, they are more or less, that's probably why I have this slide, otherwise I would not be telling you about it. But they turn out to be more or less sort of equivalent. And so that's sort of capturing the next slide, which is taking one channel and looking now across all possible channels, right, at those three different definitions that I had, right? And I'm now changing the long-term error rate of the second channel. I'm changing the expected burst length of the second channel. And I'm combining those two channels using an optimal policy, right? And what I'm asking is, what the three curves plot is, when the curve that says policy equivalent channel, it says, what are all the channels for which the best possible policy, when I pick this channel, right, is a half. Right? So if I'm looking at all the channels, right, such that the best policy when combining them, right, so if I pick a particular 15% loss, right, and now as I vary its expected burst lengths, for each value of the expected burst lengths, I get a different optimal policy in combining it with that channel, right? And for one of them, the policy is going to be use it equally. And then I'm marking it there. And then I'm changing the error rate. And then I'm marking it, right? So this curve shows for all the different long-term loss rate values, the channel that, when combined with this guy, for which the best policy is using the two of them equal. The red curve shows you all the channels that, when looked at in isolation, have the same performance as this guy. So basically this is saying, okay, if you have a channel that has a 20% loss error rate, and you're asking, let's look at it alone, and let's look at this guy alone, what is the expected burst length that is going to give me the same effective rate when using that channel alone as that of this guy? And then, I've plotted those values for all the possible long-term error rate. And again, max gain channel, it says, of all the channels that have a 15% error rate, I don't know, no constraints on the policy, right? Which is the one, when I'm varying all of these things, that gives me the best possible improvement, right, in rate. And again, the point of that curve is says these are three very different perspectives, but from a performance standpoint, they're pretty much looking at the same kind of channels. Right? So the next question is, say, okay, that's nice, right? And in particular, it's very nice that they all, the maximum gain channels and all of these other guys are pretty close to each other. But what I would like to figure out is, because from a simplicity standpoint, I would really like to be using the policy that distributes equally across all channels. What's the cost, right, of, what is the policy, and subsequently what is going to be the cost if I'm forcing myself to use a policy that is just equally distributing over the two channels. So this first curve essentially gives you a hint that, well, it might actually be okay to use a policy that just equally distributes across all channels, because it shows you for the two categories of channels that we're not necessarily using a policy that distributes transmission over the two channels. It shows you what is the actual optimal policy that they're using, and although it's not a half all the time, it's never very far from a half. And the next slide shows that actually if you were forcing each one of those scenarios to use a half transmission policy, the worst case sort of performance degradation the worst case performance degradation that you see is out there for that particular scenario. It's about 7%. So you're paying a price, but it's not a huge price. And so really the conclusion is that we've identified a relatively simple rule to determine when is it that you're going to be able to benefit from diversity, which we can determine by looking at channels in isolation. And using, in any one of those scenarios, using the channels pretty much equally, right, is actually the right thing to do, or even if it's not exactly the optimal, you don't lose too much by doing this, right? Now, the other thing that we're going to be looking at in this case of equivalent channel, right? So now we know, right, remember, I know what is the maximum gain channel, and it's pretty close to this guy, right? But I don't know how big this maximum gain is, right? And if you remember the first sort of bell-shaped curve, there were cases where even, when everything was said and done, and I was using all the channels, the two channels equally, the benefit was relatively small, right? So, although this is the maximum gain, it's not telling me anything regarding the magnitude of those gains, right? And so what we really now want to understand is, we have a handle on those cases that have the potential to yield substantial benefits, right? And we have a pretty simple way of characterizing these things and of using diversity in those scenarios, but there still are quite a few cases or scenarios within that larger set that don't necessarily give me good performance, right? And so the next thing that we would like to understand is, when is it that I can expect within that now smaller set, right, that I've identified as containing the range of potentially reasonably interesting situations, what are the things that are going to be affecting my ability to get actually substantial performance improvement, and how does that depend on the different parameters that I have introduced in my problem, namely the error rate, the burstiness, the performance target that I have, how many channels are available. So quickly, so we don't have a closed form solution or formula that I can say, you give me a channel, or a couple of channels, I plug that in, and I can tell you, yep, this is, you're going to be getting 35% improvement with that combination, and yes, indeed, the optimal policy is blah, 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 right, or close to, 50%. We understand what are the factors that are influencing all those different results, and we have a black box computation tool that actually, if you do plug the channels, will spit out what the performance that you're getting is. I'm saying it's a black box because it's essentially, it's a two-stage, it's a neural network box, right? And, they're great, but I don't understand them in the sense that it's very hard when you have a neural network that you've trained it, and you have all the training sequences, and you look at all the internal weights in the networks, and they're feed-forward networks, so they're relatively simple. Even looking at the weights, I don't have a clue of what it means regarding the structure of the solution, right? So I know it spits out the right result. I have intuition of what are the parameters that are going to be influencing, those cases where you can expect to have, good performance, right? And what are the things that are affecting the results. I don't have the connecting dots between the black box, the neural network black box, and essentially the high-level understanding that we have of the influence of different parameters. So I just want to make sure that that caveat has been sort of mentioned. So here what I'm looking at is I'm targeting a 25% improvement. Again, you could use 30 or 40% depending on what your threshold for better, for gain that's worth the added complexity. And what I'm going to look at is two equivalent channels, and here actually I'll make it even simpler. I'm going to look at identical channels. So I'm not even considering, we've seen that it doesn't really matter, right? The three classes are more or less the same, right? And I'm going to try to figure out how do things change as I vary the long-term error rate and the expected burst lengths of those two channels. What is the resulting performance gain that I get by taking two such channels and allowing you to combine them in this diversity mode? And since they're identical, the policies use them equally, obviously. Right? And basically what that shows you is that, right, it's not very surprising, is that in order to get significant improvement for a high loss rate channel, you need a less and less bursty channel. Right? But there's obviously a limit in the sense that if you come down to 1, which is the Bernoulli channel, I know that I have no benefits from diversity. Right? And so this will flatten out pretty quickly. Right? So the basic thing is, the higher the loss, the worse the long-term performance of your channel, the less bursty it needs to be in order for diversity to have some chance. Now, things are also a function of how aggressive you are in terms of the kind of performance that you want. And basically, the more aggressive you are, the better the potential that diversity has. Right? And so this is plotting two sets of curves. One of them which has a target of 98% success probability. The other one has a target of 99.5% probability of success, right? And this is showing me for 3 types of channels with decreasing, worse and worse and worse long-term error and different sort of expected burst lengths. It's telling me what kind of improvement am I getting. Am I getting 10%, 20%, 30%? And what that shows, right, so the higher order bit is, look at the scale between these guys goes up to 50, these guys go up to 80. And so the tighter your performance, the better and the more the gain that you can expect to get from diversity. And the other thing is, the lower the better the performance the channel has, the less benefit you can get from diversity. And again, it's sort of reasonably intuitive because if you have a very good channel to start with, you don't need too much coding, right? And if you don't need too much coding anyway, the room for improvement is relatively small. Right? And so the high level, conclusion is the tighter your performance guarantees, the higher the potential benefit. And if you have, and the performance also increases with when the channel gets worse. The other interesting thing from a practical standpoint is, how does the performance improvement behave as I change the number of channels, right? Because remember, obviously, if you have an infinite number of channels, you would expect some form of saturation. Right? But I don't know whether the curve is like that. Is it even sort of monotonic? I expect it to be monotonic, but you don't really know. And actually, you'll see things which is not necessarily monotonic. And the reason is, again, it's a discrete problem. So when transition between what code lengths I can use are actually taking place, varies and will affect the performance results, right? Now, this is showing you how does performance improve overall as the number of channels increases. So that part is monotonic, right? And again, if I didn't need to use all the channels, I could say go from 10 to 11 channels and never use the 11th channels. I mean, obviously, I cannot do worse with 11 channels than I'm doing with 10. Right? So the thing that is not monotonic is the individual improvement that each additional channel brings. But so the important thing is that with 3 channels, you're already at 60% of the maximum benefit that you could derive if you had an infinite number of channels. Right? And actually, the maximum number of channels that you need to use is n, right? Your code length. Because if you're sending every packet on a different channel, it's the same as if you had Bernoulli channel. Again, we don't have a proof for that, but the intuition is that that's the best that you can get if you had essentially Bernoulli channels with the same error rate. And all the experiments, all the computations that we've carried out essentially validate that. Right? So, you don't need too many channels, and adding the 4th channel, brings about less than 10% further improvement. And this keeps going down as the number of channels increases, although, as I said earlier, it doesn't keep going down consistently, because sometimes adding one more channel suddenly allows you to decrease your code by, one more packet, which then gives you that jump that we see in that particular case. Right? And it's, again, the fact that you have these sort of discrete transition points that make, as well as the fact that in the case of probabilistic policy, all the results are based on recursions, right? And getting proofs with the recursion is traditionally much harder than if you have a closed form solution, and that's another reason for why many of these results don't have proofs. So the last thing that I want to quickly talk about is, the sensitivity analysis, and there were two ways of looking at it. So what we have seen so far is that yes, diversity can pay off. We have a reasonable handle of when it's going to be able to pay off, and those payoff can go up to 70–80% improvement, which is non-negligible, although I think the average is probably more around 30–40%, at least in the scenarios that are of interest. And you can achieve those improvements using relatively simple policies, namely just distributing your transmissions equally across all the channels. Right? Now, the last thing that I would like to sort of try to assess before I sign up for a diversity type system is, how sensitive are these results, right? If you tweak the parameters of the channels a little bit, right, does the whole thing collapse? Or, is it reasonably robust, right? Does the optimal policy, this 0.5, is it very sensitive or not? Right? And so we're going to be looking at two types of changes, both changes in the parameters themselves by keeping the same two-state model, right? That'll just make the channel burstier or having worse long-term performance. And changes in the actual distribution, because very, very few channels are accurately captured by a two-state on-off model. Even the GSM channel, if you actually want to reasonably accurately capture it as like 6 or 7 states, which does make for quite a bit more complicated computations. Right? And so I want to understand how does that affect performance and the optimal solution. So these are sort of two results. I'm using 3 GSM channels in this particular case as a starting point, and I'm then going to be varying the parameters of those channels. So in the left-hand side, I'm varying the parameters of one of them, and in the right-hand plot, I'm varying the performance of all 3 of them. Right? So all of them are going to get worse. And on the left, only the 2 of them stay as regular GSM channel, and one of them starts getting worse and worse and worse, right? And this is the the percentage increase in long-term error rate. So you can get an error rate which is 20% higher than what the original estimate was. And same thing here. This is the percentage. This is the percentage increase in the expected burst lengths can go all the way up to 20%. And same thing here, except that now I'm doing that across all 3 channels instead of only one. And the blue plot is a no diversity system, and I'm plotting the total aggregate effective rate summed up over all 3 users. And the red plot is the thing that the diversity system achieves. Right? And basically what you can see is that there's very little degradation that's happening in both cases. There's a point where the system collapses, and here I'm giving using an effective rate of 0 as soon as you're not able to meet the target performance P min. Right? So I'll say even though you'll still be getting some of your packets, right, you're not meeting the performance, and so you're getting nothing. Right? Here there's actually I'm cheating in the sense that the red curve at some point drops down to 0, while the blue curve never does. Right? And the reason is that without diversity, you've completely isolated the 3 users, and therefore the worst that can happen, which is why you get that drop from 1.5 to whatever 2/3 of 1.5, is that the user that's been allocated the bad channel suddenly sees an effective rate of 0 because he's not able to get its desired target performance, but the other 2, since the other 2 channels are not changing, are staying put. And so the blue plot stays flat forever, while the red plot at some point will drop down, and all 3 users will now see lousy performance, right? But it happens at a pretty high level of degradation, over 40% in both burstiness and error rate. So if I look at things a little bit differently, and I'm trying to figure out, what is the trade-off between performance and robustness? So what I have here is the difference in effective rate between the no diversity system, right, and a whole bunch of diversity system where I've now traded off, right? Do I want to get the maximum performance improvement under the assumption that my channels are reasonably stable, or do I want to use the additional sort of margin that I have to provide for greater robustness? Right? And so this is how I'm increasing both the long-term error rate and the burstiness, and that is essentially showing you what kind of trade-off you have, right? So here, if you are actually using all of your margin to improve robustness as opposed to getting better performance under normal conditions, well, obviously you don't get much gain from a performance standpoint, only 2.7%, but you can tolerate more than doubling of both error rate and burstiness of your channel before things start going bad. And now if you, however, take all the biggest margin, allocate all of your margin towards performance, you get, higher performance improvement, but, it only takes 16% increases in loss rate and burstiness before you start essentially dropping your rate. The last thing that I wanted to talk, and I'll conclude after that, is what happens now if you change the distribution. And so what we've done, we've used a gamma distribution that lets you actually change the variance of the burst period, right, and keep the long-term error rate the same, right? So, and the average burst size the same. So everything stays the same. It's just that this two-state on-off model that had exponential, on and off distribution is just not a right model. And how bad or not right it is a function of, what is the parameter that we use for the gamma distribution, which could have a variance that is 8 times larger than that of the on-off channel. And the question that we're asking is, when do things, break, and what is the effective rate that you get? Again, for different scenarios of how am I using my margin? Am I allocating all of the margin towards greater robustness, or am I allocating it towards greater performance? And if you allocate it towards greater robustness, right, up to 4 times the variance, you are okay, right? And even 8 times the variance, although as I said, I've penalized the system by giving it a rate of 0. If you look at the probability of success that you achieve, right, compared to the target, which was 0.97, so you were tolerating a 3% error rate at the message level, you're actually pretty close to that, right? And so, again, the main message is that, diversity does actually increase your robustness, and you actually have the knobs for trading performance and robustness across a pretty broad range of things. So, what have we learned? Well, open loop systems at first sight look really trivial and not particularly, promising, but they can actually offer significant benefits, or at least they are a whole range of configuration for which the benefits can be significant. We sort of have some understanding of when is it that the potential is there, right? And you can actually get a handle of that through this equivalence of a channel concept, right? And which has the additional benefit that you don't need to have sophisticated scheduling, and transmission schedule. You can essentially transmit pretty much equally across the channels. As I mentioned earlier, right? Gains, the potential for gains are highest when you have really tight performance requirements compared to what the channel can do, or the channels are really bad. And the two are obviously sort of related, and you don't need too many channels. So sure, the more channels, the better. But it doesn't, you get, and that was confirmed across a broad range again of results that I didn't show. That you do get, 60–70% of the benefits with 3–4 channels and not, 15 channels. For those of you who are interested, there's a whole bunch of other things that we're doing in terms of both experimental validations through wireless and overlay networks, as well as looking at all kind of other sort of things. In the case of the wireless system, you can actually take collisions into account and not have any kind of coordination. It's not clear how big of an impact it has, in the sense that, you know, the more users you have greater potential for collision if they use multiple channels, but on the other hand, they don't use this, they use more access points, so they're more distributed, and that, you know, actually helps in lowering the number of collisions. So we're looking at that. We're looking at a couple of model extensions, although I don't know whether that's actually a very promising direction. And we're looking at, actually there are a whole bunch of things that I've shoved under the cover in terms of, you know, how does this channel model relate to the physical layer, and, you know, the speed at which you're trying to transmit, and the size of your packets, and so on, which are obviously very important to also take into account. And there's sort of two papers that describe some of that, and they're on our website in case people want to take a look at it. I'm done, sorry, I ran a few minutes late. Any questions? Yes?
So in the definition of the rate equivalent channels, they are both using the same code, NKME.
No, not necessarily.
So then you want to switch the code between these two?
So, I mean, that was part of the whole, so in looking at a rate equivalent channel, I'm looking at, take one channel, you're using the same cape, right? So the same message size, but the N that you're getting is not the same. However, you know, you need to realize that you can't, that you won't have too much room for play, right? Because if I have a K of 10, right, and I have a certain p-mean target of, say, 2% error rate, right, or 0.98, you know, the N value, again, is the dominant contributor to the performance, right? And the rate equivalent channels are two channels that give you the same transmission rate, right? And so, yes, I can improve performance from 0.98001 to 0.99, right? But that's not going to compensate for a big delta, you know, for 1020 versus 1012. So it is possible. There are cases where the two users actually do have different codes on the different channels, right? But I mean, not the two users, that you're using two different codes on the two different channels, but don't expect to see, you know, huge difference in N, right? You can get typically a difference of 1.
But in your definition, you are assuming two different.
Yeah, we're not constraining you to use, you know, the same code across both channels.
You assume very few users.
I mean,
What
right.
you reported was 2, 3.
That's right. I mean, so so we didn't assume any number of users, but clearly the fewer users you have, the better off you are, because you don't need to coordinate between too many people in the settings where you will need coordination, like the common access point.
But then, what is it the need for this approach when you are in a, let's say, more realistic situation where there's maybe not a large number of users, but certainly much larger than 3?
Yeah.
Have the benefits increased? Or?
Well, so, I mean, the answer, I mean, to me, right, the answer is, it doesn't matter how many users that you have, right? So let's suppose I have 100 users, 100 channels, right? What that is telling me is, I'll get 60–70% of whatever the benefits are of 100 users, 100 channel, under, you know, whatever optimal conditions, if I partition the 100 users in groups of 3. Right? And only these 3 guys share 3 channels. These 3 other guys share 3 other channels, and so on. And then the only coordination that I need to do is between people that belong to the same group, right? And so we've essentially partitioned the problem, right? So if you have a very, very large number of users, you don't need to scale the coordination to that very large number of users.
This is the fact that you don't have contention among the users, right?
That's right.
That's really at the bottom of what you're saying.
That's right. Oh, I mean, that's right. And and the need for coordination is indeed motivated by the need for avoiding contention and collision.
In other words, the only thing that can go bad is if they say grab the channel is really bad.
Right, that's right, that's right.